and we're saying we all could improve, and we're going to improve it by studying the Scriptures, by studying theology. Got a great course for you coming up from the Professorship in Catholic Thought at the University of Toledo. Highly recommend it. Next spring, easy to remember, the Tuesdays of April and May. There's 9 Tuesdays in April and May. There will be 9 excellent speakers coming under the heading of the Catholic Imagination and Contemporary Culture. So people like Richard McCormick talking on healthcare, and Brian Hare, the Bishop's Man, on social concerns, and Robert Drinan, who was in Congress and now teaches at Georgetown, will be talking about human rights. And Larry Cunningham from Notre Dame talking about mysticism. It should be an excellent course. I invite everyone to come. You can catch the lectures at 5:15 at St. Patrick's of Heatherdowns. And costs $50, and invite people to come. That's part of our ongoing theological education. Then the next thing, of course, we need is to think about ourselves. And I like the categories of conversion. A lot of the preaching books you read say we got to be holy. Well, I mean, that's nice, and it would be good. But, I mean, there's probably not a lot of us running around who think, yeah, that's right, I'm really holy, and out of that I'm going to preach. I seem to like the category of saying, no, we got to be converting. We got to be improving. We got to be in a process of improving. Bronner says something like this. He says, if he's asked, are you a Christian? Well, he doesn't want to be too strong on that. He says something like this. I am a Christian in order to become one. I am a Christian in order to become one. I live into it, but I know I haven't reached it. I like that, and I think it's a good mode for us to be in as preachers. We got to be converted. We have to be changing our lives, transforming, improving, trying to move towards the ideal. Lonergan gives us a good set of categories for doing that. Great theologian Bernard Lonergan, Canadian Jesuit, one of the giants of 20th century Catholic thought, along with Bronner. He's got this idea that we're converted in different dimensions of our being. And just to play those out, how it helps us in the preaching, affectively. Whereas that is to say, I'm in touch with my emotions, and I'm learning how to mobilize them for me, to work for me. So, I mean, you know, if we're out of sorts and we got deep angers going, or jealousies, envies that we're not aware of, that can destroy us, it's hard to preach well. We're doing better if we're in touch with those and trying to work them out and do better with them and mobilize them for effective living. So we need an affective conversion. That helps to keep us from being flat. I read some articles about preaching say that some preachers often aren't emotional enough. In other words, too constrained, too holding back. Fear of being too emotional or affective or something. Maybe we need to have greater at ease with that. If we see effective preachers, we probably can, we think of somebody like the way Governor Cuomo talks in relationship to the way Richard Nixon talked. And that's not to make political judgments, but it's just to say, if you just stop and think about that, you know, in terms of being affectively present. Think of Cuomo at the conventions. You know, a lot of analyses of why he was so effective, and part of it is that it seems his emotions are in tune with his gestures and with his words. So there's a congruence in that. I'm going to talk more about that later on. Imaginative conversion, really important. In preaching, so much of it has to do with images and symbols and stories. One of the things some of us might want to do is read more poetry, read more literature, read people like John Updike, who's got a metaphor for everything. I always feel it's the poorest part of my own preaching, and I ought to listen to myself as I'm giving this homily and spend more time with poetry and literature to get a better feel for that, because it's the symbols that often catch people and so on. So that would be to be imaginatively converted. We have to be intellectually converted, and I think that has to do with all of our study. We got to be in the process of moral conversion, in which we are actually putting on the mind of Christ and becoming a better disciple. We have to be religiously converted, which means fundamentally, in my mind, that we're in touch with the mystery dimension of life. We appreciate that we got a sense of awe to look at the starry night. We get a feeling for the woman here who's dying of cancer. That in her way God is present in that. We can see little children and see somehow God reflected in them, mystery, in their laughter, in their play, in their spontaneity. That's to have a religious sensibility. It's crucially important to me in the preaching task, to be able to uncover the mystery dimension of life in little simple things, ordinary family life. And then to be converted as a Christian. I guess I maybe said that, but that is to make the story of Jesus our own, follow out his ways and his wisdom. So, remote preparation. Now, that's going to preach better the more we're in a process of conversion, it seems to me. Then we have to know our people. Absolutely crucial that, I studied a Protestant theologian at Union Theological in New York, J.C. Hockenbeck. He said, don't preach in a church where you haven't served. Very important line. Preaching gains credibility to the degree that we're there. It makes a big difference if we're talking about dealing with sickness. If we visit the hospitals regularly and there's X number of people out there who appreciate the fact we've been with them in some of those difficult times. Talking to somebody last night who's, ministry is sort of bereavement to the bereaved, has found that I suspect that when he preaches at funerals, it has a special touch because he's been immersed in that kind of ministry. That's become his specialization in bereavement. So when he preaches at funerals, I imagine that comes across certain empathy. So listening to our people, serving our people, being present to them. The listening thing to me is a constant preparation for homilies. I try to do it all the time. That is, in any setting, if I'm at a wedding reception, surely people will want to talk. I was with Timmy too, and his son got married, and they just wandered around at the reception. And it was amazing how many people just wanted to say a few words about what was going on in their life, certain struggles, certain other things happening. And what I try to do, well, is just to be present and listen, but what emerges is certain categories, certain ways of talking. You pick up the ways people describe their joys, the way they describe their struggles. And if in a homily we can feed that back to people, then they're immediately tuned into us. So the listening thing is to pick up the way people express themselves. How do they talk? And when we say that then back to people, they hear themselves. And they resonate. That becomes an important part of all of this. Then we got all of the disciplines that can help us understand our people better, the culture they live in, and so on. And reading along that line certainly helps, it seems to me, into cultural studies. Then, next, that is to recognize our own way of preaching. And I understand you're working at this. I applaud that. I think it's a wonderful thing. Let me suggest some categories to you that you could think about to ask yourself, how do I preach? So the first and most important, and everyone who's heard me talk on other occasions knows what's coming here, and I don't need to play it out, and that is, am I a classical preacher or a contemporary preacher? The classical preacher tends to start with the scriptures or the church teaching, explains that, interprets it, looks at it, talks about it, retells it, and then says, now how do I apply that to everyday life? That's the first thing. That would be a classical preacher. So he asks you. The alternative to that, of course, is a contemporary preacher who begins not with what the church says or the Bible says, but with human experience. So the first part of the homily has to do with how people are experiencing the concern that's addressed in the Scripture. It talks about family life, or what's going on in the neighborhood, or a current problem, or our involvement in Somalia, or how people are struggling with things. In other words, you don't hear right away what the Scriptures are saying or what the church says. What you're hearing is a whole lot of stuff about the human situation now. Then the Scriptures come later to illuminate that. So, first question, are you a classical preacher or a contemporary preacher? That doesn't mean every week you would do it one way, but what's your dominant mode? Let's check this out. How many people in here, using those categories, would say that you are a classical preacher? It's interesting. How many people would say you're a contemporary preacher? I'd say slightly more was a contemporary, but not a whole lot. So that's the important thing to know. Now, one of the reasons it's important to know is what are the strengths and weaknesses of that. Well, that's what, so you just, what are the limitations I might keep in mind? For the classical preacher is, when I'm doing that whole first part, are people tuning me out? Are they listening? Are they sitting there saying, well, what's this got to do with me? I mean, that's nice, beautiful exposition of the covenant theme and the Scriptures, but what's that got to do with my life? That's the danger in there. The danger with the other side of the contemporary approach is, do we ever get around to saying what is distinctively unique and challenging about the Scriptures? Notice it remain in some sort of a mere humanism in a way. That could be one of the dangers in that. So I'm saying that with any of these categories I'm suggesting now, you could ask yourself this kind of question, what are the strengths of it and what are the weaknesses of it? So that's the first one. Now, try this. When you deal with the Scripture, I want to say this by the way. The language is this. Is my preaching sort of back there or here and now? What I mean by that is this. When I talk about, do I try to take people back now? Look at Jesus and the woman in the well. What a marvelous scene. What would it have been like to be there? If I was there thinking, what would I have heard? No, what I'm trying to do in that is take people back into that biblical period. Wouldn't it have been wonderful to walk with Jesus and to hear him? Think how it was with Peter to be called by Jesus. No, I'm taking my congregation back with me into the biblical period. The other way to do it is to be here and now. That is, I'm taking all of that and I'm saying, here we encounter Christ today as we are in the marketplace and on the job. That's where Christ is. So my dominant focus is to bring it here and now. So ask yourself that question again. Which way does it go for you? I'm not going to test this with all of these, but which way does that go? Is my preaching positive or negative about, say, secular learning or what we might get from other religious traditions? Now, somebody might say, well, it doesn't come to my mind. How would it, do I find myself saying, yeah, those secularists in our culture, those secularists, let's broaden this out and say, the culture is bad. You got to be careful out there. There's a lot of hedonism. There's a lot of secularism. This is a pretty bad world we're in. Or am I more positive about that? Do I tend to say, boy, look at those good things that are happening there. Look at we got freedom in this country. We got democracy. This culture works well for us. The church has flourished here. And we got a wonderful sense of self-actualization in our culture. So, I sort of aligned a couple there, and I'm not sure exactly, but is there a tone, that says the world's a bad place, this world we live in is a terrible place, and we're going to be negative about it, or are we more positive? Ask yourself that kind of question. When we talk about Jesus, do we tend to talk more about the historical Jesus or the risen Christ? The liberation theologians are a good example of people that emphasize the historical Jesus. Look at this Jesus. He walked around with the outcasts. He took care of the poor. He was open to all of the people on the margins. Look at what he was like in his life. He challenged the religious authorities. People who emphasize the other side, it's Christ. Christ is present. Christ has given his Spirit. Christ is a lot in the world today. Christ is guiding us by giving us the Spirit. The risen Lord is what we want to talk about. The cosmic Christ, the Théâtre des Jardins. Where's the emphasis in my own preaching? I'm sure everybody's got both in there one time or another, but where's my own emphasis? The historical Jesus or the risen Christ? When I talk about the church, do I talk about the church largely as an institution, as a hierarchical system, as having a boss in Rome and a bishop that we're supposed to follow and grades and orders of things, that it's a powerful force in the world and it conserves the tradition and so on? Or do I talk about the church more as a community, as the people of God, sort of equality? We're all co-responsible. We're all together in this church. Ask yourself that sort of thing. Is there a stress in your preaching on the ordinary or the extraordinary? When I tell stories, do they sound like, wow, that's amazing. This woman was out there and she saw a vision of the Blessed Virgin Mary. And Medjugorje is what we got to keep in mind. And that's what gives us hope. And look at these wonderful things that happened. I had a miracle in my own life. This is where it went. Or do I tend to talk more about, the intimations of the presence of God, the clues, the more subtle ways in which God is at work, in a friend at work who said a kind word to another one and it seemed to start a chain reaction and things are going better at work now. See the difference? And you can ask yourself, how much do I concentrate on the ordinary and how much on the extraordinary? How much is my preaching private and how much public? We can ask ourselves, if we address the topic of sin, is it usually in terms of private sin, personal sins, or social sin, injustice? Do I find myself preaching a lot on public policy questions, like what we ought to do about Somalia or Bosnia, or people ought to vote, and people ought to be involved in the secular world, and so on? Or do I talk more about personal piety, prayer, get closer to God, love your neighbor, take care of your wife and spouse? Am I more public or more private in my preaching? And finally, do I emphasize more the cross or the resurrection? People listen to me over years' time, and they hear it a lot. You've got to carry the cross, discipleship, you're like the seed, you got to go in the ground and die, got to have mortification, got to have asceticism. We all face death, got to get ready for it. Christ died for us on the cross. He suffered for us. Or is my emphasis more on resurrection? There's growth, there's life. The Lord was raised to a new glorious life. He shares that with us. Look at all the signs of the resurrection in our world. Every time I see somebody do something good, somebody follows their conscience, acts responsibly, reaches out to help a neighbor, there's resurrection at work. Ask ourselves, which side of that divide do we tend to come down on? Now, So all of that is, we need to recognize how we preach, what style we use. I can do all of that in terms of the great theologians. I made a conscious decision this morning not to do that. In other talks I've done that, and I don't know why I decided against it. But you see, most of us could find a major theologian and their approach and say, that's sort of how I am. Because we don't invent this, we pick it up, and the greats have epitomized this. So to preach like Karl Rahner is to preach differently from Karl Barth, the great Protestant theologian of the 20th century. So by looking at the great theologians who studying theology, we could sort of see, yeah, that's the way I do it. I do it like Rahner, or I do it like Skilbeck, or I do it like Clark or Tillich, or any of the great giants of theology. Would be another way of approaching all of that. How are we doing? When did I start? 9:30. How about doing this? Could I ask you to turn to a person next to you for just a minute and say out of all the stuff I said so far, what strikes you most positively? Instead of saying, this guy's off the wall, what's he talking about? I mean, you could do that, but instead of that, adopt a more positive tone. And try to figure out something I said that you could say, that's what I'm going to work on for the next year, or that's what I could do, or that's what I need. So I invite you to turn to the person next to you and try to talk like that for a couple of minutes. There we go. One in Christ, one to the church. Anybody else positive? This is to give reinforcement to the church. Some positive, yes. No. And anyway, to think of the whole New Testament as a document of ideals that work for somebody. Somehow it seems more realistic to me. It seems less arrogant. Let's say I'm a Christian in order to come one. Seems arrogant, seems more open, seems more true to experience. I like.
We may never fully
rise the kingdom. The kingdom's over here, but not complete. We live in the temple. I learned first from Charles Curran many years ago, and I like it. I think it's a good way to think of the scriptures in the Christian. Is this the mic too close? Is the mic for something? Are you doing okay with that?
Yeah, get down the kitchen there.
Okay, so can we move on? I just do it sort of self-evident. I had to say so it doesn't probably. Well, I was asking how words are sold. Somebody just said religion. That's a big word, or I think even for some people, turn off the word. A lot of times you say, are you religious? The young people, they act negative. I'm out there. But are spiritual minded as a field? A lot of finding the right word, and there's tough words that one has to be careful of that. I use the word religious to suggest people who have a feeling for definition of life, who have a sense of mystery. Someone who's going to get married and thinks he's going to give his friend $500 and stop and buy something for instead of giving her a ring, not a religious person. This person has no feel for the myth dimension, the faith dimension, the death dimension. People are tuned up. A lot of people are very people are going to get that and are very God, but they're not religious at all. They have low IQs. In fact, there's a lot of we're preaching out there. Remember this. There's people out with low IQs. They're the ones who are asleep. No, they're the ones who are this out. They're not into it. They come to church, these their wife or husband, or give good to their kids, they're afraid they're going to hell. But they don't get liturgy. It doesn't move them, doesn't touch them. They have low IQs. That does not make them people. They might be very close to God. They could be holy. You have a very holy person who's got low IQ. It's like being told that. Well, it's valuable for us because as I'm standing up there preaching and there's these these two young people out there talking, and there's another guy asleep. Instead of getting bent out of shape or shouting or getting more, what do I usually do? There's a word, I get something. I get pushy. That's the right word. Strident, that's the word. I get strident then because I'm going to get him. You're not going to go to sleep on me. I see you back there. You're not going to sleep on me. I just get it. You got to get it. Well, instead of becoming strident, one just can sort of step back, take a deep breath, and say, that guy's got a low arc. Low arc view. Nice guy, though. Holy, but low arc view, so now I'm going to talk to the rest of you people with higher arc views. We're in sync with one another. Very valuable thing. Well, the word religion, religious. So now I'm into more proximate preparation, getting closer now to actually preaching. And so I'm thinking that it's good, we got a lectionary, right, that's on a cycle, ABC, and we picked one of the Gospels as the major one for the year. We got, isn't it Mark coming up? Did I get the right one? Coming up in Advent? Yes. A, B, C. Right. Good. I thought I was on the right one there. So that what we could do, in other words, is somewhere along I get a feel for that year. So there's a lot of books coming out now on Mark because they know there's preachers around. They're going to preach on Mark for a whole year, and let's get ready for it. So that'd be one thing to do. What's distinctive about Mark's Gospel? Mark's Gospel is wonderful. It's so different. It's so terse, and it's, like I said, MTV jumping all over the place. It's very disruptive. There's a theory that it appeals a lot to people who have, how can I get without getting too esoteric, you got a postmodern mentality for people who got a sense of the absurdity of life, of the strangeness of it all, the people who are afraid of terrorist attacks, or going up in a plane and falling down out of the sky, people who have a sense that their emotions are out of control. Mark's Gospel seems to have a special appeal to them. You might look at that. The literary, so the book I suggested there, Mark and Method, is all those literary kind of studies I was talking to you about, of how to read Mark's Gospel more effectively. But that's one thing you could do, or just before the first Sunday of Advent, read Mark straight through for yourself. Just get a feel for the whole Gospel. What's it like? What's the tone? What's Jesus like in Mark's Gospel? What's that all to do about he works a miracle and says, don't tell anybody? There's odd things in there. And the ending is even odder. The ending of the Mark's Gospel is weird. It ends with people being scared and confused. What is this? The tomb's empty. I mean, that's a strange ending to a gospel. You know, if you look in the new translations, you'll see that it really doesn't end there because somebody later on thought that was too weird and added something on. They'll say the addition. It's not Mark. Whoever wrote Mark didn't write the last chapter. They added on. And when you stop where it really stops, and it's shocking. But one of the theories is that what it tells us is, well, what are we supposed to do? The tomb's empty. We're scared. Well, it ends like that. It tells us we're the ones that got to go about doing it. We're the ones who have to do the preaching and the evangelizing. They were too scared to do it. So, anyway, a lot of things about Mark's Gospel are interesting, and for each year we could do that. Then, having some sense of the whole liturgical year in our mind. What does it mean to preach during Advent and Lent, and what are the major feasts, and how do we organize all of that? There's a book that we use in our parish, that source book I mentioned there, that gives a feeling for the whole year. Then, narrowing it down even more, finding a focus for each Sunday. Now, here we get the crucial thing. That is, what are we going to preach on this Sunday? Now, I think we make the decisions in the light of a lot of things. The overall theme of the year, maybe. You know, overall focus. Like in my parish this year, we're focusing on building community. So every time we're looking at a Sunday readings, we got that in the back of our mind. As a whole year focus, yeah, building community. And now how are we going to go about that? So we're always slanting at that, we're looking for it. So that influences how we do it. Now this is really crucial. Now it gets far more practical. It's your turn to preach. What do you preach on? And how do you figure that out? Okay, now I have suggestions along that line that I'm sure not everyone would agree with, but I think it's a dialogue. The dialogue is between the needs of the community. What's going on in my parish here and now? In this first Sunday of Advent, in this year, or October 24th, to go back to this thing, when I preach October 24th, 30th Sunday in ordinary time, what's going on in my community? So I got that in my mind. That's not my total answer, though, because I got, in my community, it's fourth week of the academic term or something. It's midterms, and my students are upset by midterms, so I got to keep that in mind. But that doesn't mean I preach on midterms. No, because the other part of the dialogue is what is in these three readings that I'm assigned. Now, when we start to look at that side of it, I think a helpful question to ask oneself is, what human concern was in the mind of that author when they wrote that? What was the existential problem that prompted this writer of the book of Exodus for the 30th Sunday here to say, you shall not molest or oppress an alien. Watch out for the widows and orphans. I am compassionate, says God. What was going on in his community that made that author write that like that? Well, you can almost guess, right? Somebody's oppressing the aliens, the widows, and the orphans. I mean, you don't have to be a great scholar to figure that out. Something's going on. Now, it would be nice to know more about that, and to read a commentary and find out what was going on more precisely. Why were they oppressing widows, orphans, so on? Why weren't they taking care of them? Who were they? How bad off were they? And so on. That would be good to know. But the first question I ask myself, I'm trying to figure out what I'm preaching on, right? Understand the question? What am I preaching on this Sunday? Oh, I'm looking at these readings, I'm asking myself, what does the author have in mind? What problem, concern, challenge, triumph, joy stands behind what he wrote? Why did he write it? Now, I can do that for the third reading, too. And again, we've got, as the commentator here says on the one I sent to you, there's a big problem. You can't just look at this passage. You've got to look at this passage in the light of Matthew's whole gospel, but you also got to look at it in the light of what went right before it. And what went right before it, as he tells you, is they were arguing about the resurrection of the dead. Well, you go look in your Bible, so I have to read this in context. Then I see what prompted Jesus to talk about love of God and neighbor? Well, they wanted to trip him up, and they wanted to know what was the greatest commandment. So what was the concern behind this? Jesus is trying to get at the essence of what his preaching is all about. And for the second reading, we can do the same thing. What prompted Paul to write what he wrote? What was going on then? You became a model. You must be proud of those people. But the commentaries will help you to know that. So what have I got so far? I got a sense of what are the needs of my community. They're in midterms here. A lot of tension expressed in my community here. And over here, I begin to get a feel for what these authors are, what problems they're dealing with. Now, what I'm trying to do then to get my focus point for all this is to begin to put that together. I must keep it in context because I got to know what I preached on last week or the last few weeks, and I got to know what we're preaching on in the future. That's why what we do at my parish is we try to get the focus points together for a big period of time, like all of Advent, all of Lent, the first part of ordinary time, so that one is, in making a decision, isn't preaching on the same thing every week. Now you've got another, as we all know, the first and third readings often go together, and the second reading is often different. It doesn't fit in the cycle. So very often we are faced with a choice here. Do I preach on what the first and third readings say, what theme they bring out, or do I go with the second reading? And that's a nice option, it seems to me, to have. Now it's out of that sort of dialogue, it seems to me, that we begin to come up with a focus. Now in my parish, what we used to do is we would sit around with our staff and figure out the focus. That is, everyone would read a different commentary, everyone say what they got out of it, then we talk about the community, what's the needs of what's going on, and then jointly we would come up with a focus. Out of that we'd be listing, oh yeah, you think this, you think that. Here's our focus. And I think there's something good to be said about that. Instead of one person sitting down and figuring this out, it seems better to have a group working on it, where it begins to emerge from what various people see and various people's commentaries and so on. That's one way of coming at it. Some people might have to do that on their own, but I think it's always a little trickier, and because it's so easy to get on one track and just be going in one's own direction and without having the input of all other people. So we got to figure out what this focus is. You know, I mean, again, frankly, in my place, if the second reading is on a sexual question, and the first two are on the judgment of God, first and third on judgment of God, and we have not preached on sex for the whole quarter, and it's now the 8th week. In all likelihood, we're going to take the second reading and preach on sexual matters for our Ephesians. Now, there's probably something comparable in your own communities here that one would try to come up with. You'll note another thing. I'm using the word focus and not theme. There's a lot of resistance to the idea of thematic approaches these days, and I'm not sure I buy it all, but we've changed language. Instead of saying, what's the theme, we say, what's the focus point? That is a different flavor to us. It's a little broader and more of an umbrella notion, and it doesn't suggest there's only one way of going about it and so on. So we got to pick a topic. Those are some suggestions about how we would come up with what we're going to preach about. Then the next step is to begin to collect information around this. And again, once we have our focus point, we're just saying how we do it in our parish, we'd have 7 or 8 people sitting around at that point. Maybe at times an invited guest, somebody else, but we say, okay, here's the focus point. Now, let's begin to talk about these readings and this community in the light of that focus point. So let's take this Sunday, the 30th Sunday. So what I end up saying is that what we've got is a situation where there's a lot of tensions in our community, and this love God and love your neighbor is becoming much harder, and it has become much harder loving your neighbor during this time, because roommates are getting on each other's nerves, and there's tensions and stresses in the community, and therefore we have to concentrate out of all that Jesus said there on love of neighbor. A lot of people will be praying more, they're into God because they have to pass exams, but we're going to emphasize this sort of love of neighbor thing. Now, what we then do is everybody in our group, 7 or 8 people, will read a different commentary. And that we'll just go around and have everyone say, well, in my commentary it says this, and so on. It's one way to go about this. Then we begin to pool ideas. Okay? Then the other source is, well, what images are in these scripture readings that strike me? Go back to the images. Like, what's the phrase? Or, what is it that really grabs you out of these readings here? What is the thing here? They're trying to trip him up. Trip him up. That's a phrase that strikes me about all this. Okay. Someone else says, yeah, you know what gets me? It's that first reading. I'm compassionate. I love that image of God. I'm compassionate. That's Yahweh speaking in the midst of all this. What else has he to sleep? If he cries out to me, I will hear him. The oppressed, the alien, the widow, the orphan. I'm compassionate. Oh, I love that. I'm compassionate. That's something that, oh good, we're all collecting this now. So that resonates with some people. Then we go back and say, now, well, what is it that you get out of it? I mean, what does it mean to you? How are you struggling to live out this love of neighbor? So he says, what really, for me, when I hear that, my problem is really envy. It's hard for me to love people when they're getting ahead and they're lousy people. What really bugs me is that one of our students sitting in this group is that this girl who's been so promiscuous, she runs around all the time, and now she's got a boyfriend who's really nice and probably going to be able to marry him. She was promiscuous all that time. Now she suddenly found this guy, and it's going to go well for her. And here we are sitting around and trying to have high moral standards, and I can't find a boyfriend. So she's supposed to love us. So now we begin, how do I experience this concern here that we're supposed to love the neighbor? Then we go back and try to look at how the community experiences this need. Well, we're going to preach on love of neighbor. We preached on that 4 months ago. What are we going to say about it? I mean, everyone heard it already. They're going to tune us out. Oh, we need a slant on it. We need some distinctive way of looking at that love of God and love of neighbor we didn't have before. I was talking to some students the other day, and they said, the ones they can't stand are the international students. They all hang together, and they don't talk English. And what are we going to do about them? Yeah, I heard some students say, so we begin to fill in the picture. I'm sitting there taking notes through all this, collecting ideas, collecting material. Not just out of my own head, but from 7 other people. Begin to enrich the mix. Okay, so that is something about what I'm calling this more consummate preparation. I list some books there that I find Reginald Fuller's book, Preaching the Lectionary. I think it's preaching the New Lectionary, isn't it? People know it. How many people use that? Wow, yeah. How about Monica Helwig's Gladness Through Their Escort? How many? People aren't into Monica. She's wonderful. One of the best resources I know. And then, Phil Skellin gave me one. Charles A. Curran, Word Become Flesh, 3 volumes. Somebody use that. Few are in tune with that. We use Sloyan, we use some of the homily. All 7 people have to have a different commentary so that they feed ideas into them. So we're getting a broad range. So we got a lot of choices that way. Okay, let me see if anyone wants to ask me a question about this and make a comment. Yeah.
The 7 people that you have, how do you get them to these?
There are staff people, including a student volunteer. We have had times when we would invite somebody else in to be part of it. I mean, it would be good, like if it was Campaign for Human Development Week and somebody was really involved in some project with that, it'd be great to have them in. Or we know we're going to preach on housing, to bring in somebody who knows something about that. We don't do that often. I think it's a lack, but we have done it, and I think it's a good thing to do. But that would be myself, Dan Zach, Pam Meserol, people on our staff, including our secretary, by the way. Very important in our mind. The input that comes that way. Tim's wife used to do that for us. She was a wonderful input for that. people we would assemble. You can do it now. I'll tell you another way I do this. I meet with a group of faculty on Friday over lunch. We discuss the readings for the following Sunday. So we set it up that way. So now I got another circle here. Now I'm getting what they think about it. Now another group of maybe 8, 9, 10 people. More input. Oh, we're getting a lot now, you know. I mean, this is not just isolated activity. And they, and I can sort of prompt it, I now got an idea what I'm preaching on, what the focus is, where we're meeting for this group here. What about this, love your neighbor here, what's the hardest part of that for you? What's the hardest part of loving your neighbor for you? Now I got 9 people sitting there maybe answering that question. What I'm listening carefully. What I'm listening for is how do they say it? What do they say and how do they say it? It's very likely that their phrases are going to work their way into my homily. The very words that they use. I might not attribute them, probably won't attribute them, but the phrases, now I've got a slice of life. That's at least how somebody's saying it. Love your neighbor, it always bugs me. Yeah, it's such an odd thing to say, love your neighbor. Well, it's harder for me to tell you the truth to love my teenage daughter. She doesn't give me the time of day. She won't talk to me. If I ask her, where are you going? She says, out. When are you coming back later? I want to know what's going on at school. She won't tell me. She shut me out of her life for 3 years now. She is a hard person to get along with. You want to talk about sullen teenagers, I got one in my house. I don't know if it's ever going to be any different. I can't wait till she becomes an adult and I can talk to her again. Now we begin to see, aha,